Good evening. Today is Monday, June 10th. The time is 7 o'clock. We are now in session of the Canby Planning Commission. Today on the agenda, we have one public hearing. Before we will get to that, we will first ask if there is any citizen input on non-agenda items. Not seeing any citizen input. We do have a quorum here with 5 commissioners. That it does constitute a quorum of the Canby Planning Commission, so we are able to do business tonight. Our first public hearing is a remand from the City Council to consider a revised application. So I'm going to treat this as if it is an entirely new public hearing for the purposes of my recitals. I'm going to go through the recitals today, so everybody in the audience, that we have a larger audience this time that would like to know of these things, is put on notice of these things. So our public hearing format. The matter presently before the hearing body requires a public hearing. The public hearing today is the public hearing to consider approval of a revised site and design review to build a new public library to be located at 162 Northwest 2nd Avenue in the C1 Downtown Commercial Core Commercial Subarea of the Downtown Overlay Zone, DR 13-01. All interested persons in attendance shall be heard on the matter. If you wish to testify on this matter, please step forward to the microphone when it's your turn. State your name, address, and interest in the matter. We will discuss the procedures for that later. You may be limited by your time for statements depending on how many people wish to testify. Probably not. We will not have those limitations tonight unless a lot more people come. But the public hearing will be conducted as follows. First will be the staff report. Second will be questions the commission has for staff. Third will be open public hearing for testimony. First will come the applicant, and then will come any proponents, and then will become opponents to the application, and then any rebuttal by the applicant. And then we'll close public hearing. At the close of public hearing, we will open the discussion and questions up for the commission to ask questions, probably at that time just of staff and of each other, but we have in the past opened that up for questions of the applicant too. Maybe to a limited extent. For longer presentations, the proponents and opponents may buy time from one another. That will not be applicable tonight, so we will skip that rule. Everyone that's present that has an opinion on this is encouraged to testify, even if it's only to concur with previous testimony. All questions should be directed to the chair. Any evidence to be considered must be submitted to the hearing body for public access if it's written. If it's orally, you can speak it only. Written testimony previously received both for and against the application shall be summarized by staff or included in the staff report, because we won't require staff to go through all of it tonight, but it is in the staff report, which is made available publicly, and it will be presented briefly to the hearing body in the staff report if staff has that as part of their report. Testimony and evidence must be directed toward the applicable criteria listed in the code and in the staff report, or other criteria in the comprehensive plan or land use regulations which the person offering the argument or evidence believes applies to the decision. Failure to raise an issue accompanied by the statements or evidence sufficient to afford us as the decision maker and any interested parties an opportunity to respond to the issue may preclude an appeal to the Land Use Board of Appeals based upon that issue. Failure of an applicant to raise any constitutional or other issues relating to the proposed conditions of approval with sufficient specificity to allow the local government to respond to the issue may preclude an action for damages in circuit court, which is not likely today. With that said, we will ask duly for any of the commission that has ex parte contact or a conflict of interest on this matter to please signify by saying that you have something and then explaining what it is. So, does anybody have a conflict of interest or an ex parte contact?
I do not.
No. I would reiterate that since this is a remand, technically this would be a different hearing. There were some I guess, comments that people knew about the library issue generally and things that were talked about at the last hearing, but nobody in the audience objected, and none of the commissioners had any problems with anything that anybody had done. So those would probably be carried over. They're on the record that there were generalized conversations about the library before we even knew this was coming to us. So with that said, is there anyone in the audience that has any objections to anyone on the commission participating today? Not saying any objections from the audience, we will move directly on to the public hearing.
Okay, I'm
Brian, you can do it
I'm
today?
gonna start off our introduction here, the presentation for the city, and representing basically the applicant, since the city's the applicant.
Oh,
for
you're
this
going to be the applicant
process.
today?
Well, we are the city. The city is the applicant, and so I'm going to introduce our team so that you know who's here.
Let me put you on pause for 1 second. So you guys going to be both the staff report and the applicant today? Because that's a change. Last time we had Angie present the staff report, and the applicant had its own people as a separate division.
Well, now you're confusing me with particulars. We are staff, and we are presenting the report for you, and I'm going to introduce the city team, because this is a city application.
Okay.
And so I'm going to give a brief overview of the changes for this particular revised submittal. And then I'm going to ask you whether you want some particulars on the conditions of approval that are part of the original staff report that was presented at your previous hearing. If you want to go through that up front with some questions to staff about those, or whether you want to wait until you close the public hearing and get into deliberations to go over those conditions of approval, whichever you feel more comfortable with.
Well, let's have things that changed on the. Let's have somewhat of a focus. Anybody that's going to present anything, don't feel like you're necessarily constrained by this, but let's try and focus on the things that changed from the last application. We don't have to rehash some of the issues that were not in controversy. But there were, I think, 4 particular things that were in controversy. Anything relating to those and conditions would certainly be something that would be totally open for let's discuss it today.
Now, if we move down the road of considering approval of this application, I think you'll want to make sure that you're fully aware of the conditions that have been recommended in the staff report. And there are a few minor adjustments in those, and the main place to look at those conditions of approval are in the 2 sets of findings that we provided for you tonight. You have a set of findings for recommending approval, and you have a set of findings for recommending denial of this application. And the conditions of approval are listed in the one recommending approval. Rather than referring back to the original staff report. That's really what I was trying to make a clarification. And there was a change in 2 of those conditions, just that we've made, and I don't know, did we distribute it up there on their dais? So if you've got the latest, greatest version, when you get to those conditions, you can be referring to the findings that recommend approval, and the conditions that are listed in there are the ones that staff is recommending at this point. And out in the audience, we have solicited the services of Attorney Carrie Richter with the Garvey Schubert Bearer, and she's going to help focus on a couple of the concerned areas that you had at your previous hearing. Those were dealing with the mass and bulk of the building, its size and height and such. And the other issue that a lot of discussion was on the ownership and the signature on the application form. And so she's here to address those 2 issues tonight for you, to give you a feeling of your ability to choose approving as well as denial in this application regarding those two issues. And then we have FFA Architecture, and we've got Eric Wilcox and his team here tonight to be able to answer any of those specific questions dealing with the design of the building and the specifics of the circulation plan up and down the private alley that goes on the south side of the building, and questions that have been raised by Matt Michael with Canby Utility about how it functions in relation to his existing ownership of the property that's to the south, and how those are going to function. And as we mentioned before, and even more so as this revised applications come before you, is that the parking lots that are adjacent to the library are not part of this application in any way. The only tenuous relationship is that the private drive that is on the south side of the building does connect with those adjacent properties, and that's relevant in how that connection happens. And that's where the studies that we had done by the city's traffic engineer, DKS, and their review, and there's record submittals talking about a revised direction for that street that you'll want to make sure that you're aware of, and that it's a one-way flow in from Holly Street now going into the site and flowing back out to First Avenue, and how those radiuses and the width and those type of things in front of the drop-off window have all been addressed by both the FFA's civil engineer and the traffic engineer that the city itself has on call to help us with these things. Then we've got Greg Ellis in the audience, our city administrator, and he's available as part of the city's team, having been through all of the meetings that have to do with the negotiations that are involved with the property on where we're proposing this library to be set. And as you know, there's 4 tax lots involved, and one of those tax lots is not owned by the city, but Canby Utility. And Greg is available to answer any specific questions that you might have regarding that issue. And we'll go from there.
Is Matt Michaels available for questions as well?
He certainly is.
Okay, thank you.
Great. So just real quick then, I've kind of gone over it, but this, we're here because there was a remand taking advantage of an Oregon statute to bring this back, even though you reviewed this, deliberated, and denied an application that was before you back in May, on May 13th. The city regrouped and said, I think that we can do better and we can revise this application and address some of the concerns that you had. And one of the major changes in this application really has to do with the landscaping, and that's one of the areas the Planning Commission focuses on all of our site and design reviews. You usually have a lot to say about the landscaping requirements. And in this particular case, FFA stepped up and said, well, we can do better. And they think they have a good proposal for you this time. And what it's done is allowed us to get rid of the need for a variance application because it fully meets the code now. They did admit to me that it costs a little bit more money now, but we have a much better plan that's being presented to you in this revised submittal. Then I've already mentioned that we want to and wanted another opportunity to further address the height issue. We did discuss that in pretty good detail at your original hearing, but I think there's more information that we'll be able to share tonight regarding that issue. And just simply with the idea that signing an application form in its practice in the planning department, at least for the 4 years that I've been here, is more of a matter of, is the owner of the property aware that an application is occurring on their property. And of course, we know that Matt Michael's here, and he's more than aware that this application, and the sequence of things, that it's necessary that you have to have a land use application and a decision regarding that before you can get all of the other things that fall in line to happen. And it's common practice on every application to do conditions of approval that will solve and put your mind at ease on whatever concerns you might have. And in this case, particularly with not having construction happen on a property before the final issues are taken care of. I think really that's the main issues, and I'm going to let the experts that we have here and the rest of the team get up and explain some of those. So at this point, I'll open it for any questions that you have. There is a revised submittal, if it wasn't clear to you, because in the packet on the city's website is the original staff report and the original applicant submittal, but there's also a revised submittal by the applicant with new narrative that purged it from the variance, landscape variance application, and also tried to go through and represent some of the other minor changes that were needed to clarify that the landscaping had changed and that the one-way driveway had been introduced and those kind of things. If you have any questions about any other submittals that we have, and I could go through just to make sure that you're aware
Brian,
what those are.
is it accurate that the Canby Utility Board and the city representatives through the redevelopment agency haven't met yet? They meet tomorrow. The meeting is tomorrow. I saw
Yeah, there
in the
is
correspondence. The meeting's tomorrow,
yes,
right?
there's a Canby Utility meeting tomorrow on June 11th. And
So
there's
we had correspondence here that people had expected something to take place at that meeting, but it won't be final. Nothing will be final till tomorrow.
That's right.
Okay.
And again, I'll just, if you have any specific questions about any of the conditions, we can discuss those in detail if you get to deliberations, or if you want to ask. I've got Angie here, since she went over those last time and helped type up the final set that staff's recommending, if you have any questions about those.
One other question on the preliminary matter. I don't know if any of the rest of the commissioners were there. I wasn't there at the city council hearing. In reading the city council's decision, it looks like they did not consider any of the merits of anything. All they said is there's a revised application we'd like you to take a look at. Is that accurate?
That's right.
That's what's in the letter?
They immediately said that they need the planning commission's recommendation. It was the idea that staff said we can address some of their concerns, so we want to revise our application. And they said they needed your review before they would look at that. And of course, if you approve this, the council won't need to see it.
Brian, you said you were gonna, maybe you were kind of going through it, and I just didn't really catch it, but you're gonna go over what the changes are in the conditions of approval, either after the applicant
No,
goes
I was
forward,
going to give you that option. If you wanted us to list those real quickly for you now, we could do that. If you want to do that up front, or whether you want to wait till later.
Sure.
or- Yeah, I'd prefer it now.
Okay.
If everybody else is fine with
So
that.
I'm going to let Angie try to go through those then.
Did we throw you off your game by doing that?
No.
No.
Okay.
You can still throw strikes.
Are you ready to go over those right now?
Yeah, go ahead,
Okay,
Angie.
so,
Thank you.
there's been a small little packet placed before you on the dais, and there's a revised version because we proposed rewording for condition number 3 and 16.
Maybe this one's not- okay.
So,
That's the one for potential.
there's a paperclip packet of new information.
There's
So-
nothing that has conditions of approval that's the no, right?
That
That
hasn't
would make-
changed from the one that was in your packet.
Yeah, it's the same.
Okay.
So down at the bottom, you're going to see findings and conclusions and final order.
Okay.
So in order to expedite
That's the
processing this, we did prepare, still looking for it.
Sorting through the various different ones here. They haven't got that one too. Got filed that one.
It was not in
Need
there.
some
No.
of that binders.
Go ahead. No, I'm not waiting. Don't wait for me.
Okay.
What's in the middle?
So, to expedite processing this, we prepared draft final findings for both approval and denial. We're hoping to get a final decision tonight. So, on the draft final findings of approval, and we have some blanks, in these draft final findings, on the first page, we have a blank for your vote. Second page has some blanks for any additional findings you might want to add in. You could put those in writing, and we can type them up, or you can just have them in writing. That's just an area for that, if necessary. So briefly, I can go over the conditions. Condition 1 is a standard condition stating the approvals based on the submitted materials, and modifications must be processed for the code's procedures, and we're kind of doing that tonight with modifications. Condition 2 is a standard curb sidewalk matching condition per the standards of 1608. Condition 3 contains, we did revise this, and that's the revision that we made a couple of days ago when we got DKS's revised memo reviewing the new plans that have a different driveway and proposed circulation. So corresponding revised conditions of approval, those are just, so that's what number 3 is. They've just been revised to reflect that. Number 4 is a condition to provide the city with the access easement copies if there's going to be an access easement along the driveway. 5 is a standard bicycle rack configuration condition per the parking standard of the code, parking chapter of the code. 6 is a sign size condition for to reflect 1642. It's for the proposed city seal sign that'll be on there but wasn't reflected in the plans, so we added a condition for that. 7 through 9 are standard lighting conditions. 10, we discussed last meeting. We want to ensure the trash and recycling area is screened with landscaping, and it is on the plans shown to be screened, but we added that condition in because the landscaping is actually on a property south of the site, which is not technically part of this design review. So we added that in. Condition 12 reflects the code's requirements that parking lots be approved under administrative type 1 review. And we also added in, per CUB's request, that CUB be notified of any parking lot applications that might occur in conjunction with this project. So we added in that CUB will be notified of those so they can provide any comments that they wish on any if and when we get parking lot applications. 13 is a standard reiteration of accessible parking review procedures. 14 is a standard agency coordination condition. 15, standard public works design standard condition. 16, this was simplified, and basically this is the condition to alleviate the property ownership, proposed condition to alleviate the property ownership concerns. We've reworded it to read, the design review application shall be signed by all property owners prior to the issuance of building permits. That's just in case the city and Camden Utility, might have a leasing agreement or final transactions. A lot of applications, the applicant and the owner are different. So I think before we said provide proof that the city is the owner of all the lots. That's not really what we're after. We're just looking for consent on the application. So that's the proposed rewording of that. And then 17 through 19 are standard pre-construction procedural conditions. Questions, comments?
Thank you.
Well, yeah, I have a question. Knowing that we previously stated that it was a problem to have an applicant applying for property that didn't have the consent of the landowner, why didn't we wait on this hearing to have it after the owner has consented?
I think there's construction timeline. I mean, why did we wait? I guess, I'm sorry.
If, for instance, there's a meeting tomorrow.
Okay.
Why didn't we wait till next Monday to have a meeting if the owner definitively does approve of this application or not?
I think the city has its timelines that
Yeah,
they're trying to meet. So.
I think the timing was to, this, as any private developer project, and especially has been critical in this project, is trying to keep things moving. There's so many pieces in this puzzle that the remand to the council was done immediately, and with the idea that that was the preferable way to handle that section of the Oregon statute, was to take care of that issue immediately. And in doing so, there was a belief at that time that we would have been further along and those meetings would have taken place. And we have to do 20 days notice and provide the notice to surrounding property owners and such. And so we have to do things, and things are changing every day. So at this point, we were hopeful that that would have already had happened,
Mr.
but
Chair,
it hadn't.
Go ahead.
that 20 days notice is as of when? When was that 20 days notice given?
Prior to this scheduled public hearing,
I mean, for council, when was that notice given?
there wasn't notice to the council.
No, notice to the
remand.
public for council. Is that not what you said?
No. Notice for this revised
particular
public
meeting.
hearing.
Okay, that was my
Right.
question.
Did anybody, I guess, mention this to the city council? I mean, I don't know if you guys did, it's a minor part, but one of the things that was most, I think, commonly mentioned by us as commissioners is that we, as commissioners, don't want to be seen as doing something for the city, because we're part of the city, that we wouldn't doing favors or special process or
Right.
anything like that, that we wouldn't do for a regular Joe resident that's filing an application. And the city just can't, sort of has come back to us and said, oh, we don't care, we want you to rush it anyways. And that's the concern that I have as chair, is that we make sure we're deliberating, we're applying the same rules to everybody, regardless of the fact it's the city council, the people that appointed us here, that's sending this to us. And I don't, doesn't seem like they addressed that at all. I don't know, I mean, I know that's a gripe, and maybe you don't have the answer for it, but that's why I asked that question, I guess.
Yeah. I don't really have the answer, other than the fact that the city council is the deciding body, and so we invoked that provision of Oregon statute that allowed them to make a decision what they felt was best to do, and they chose to remand it.
Okay. All right, let's go to your, if there's
I
more
got-
questions.
Yeah, no, just something just popped in my head here. So on condition 3, on letter B, it's asking the applicant to consider prohibiting on-street parking on Northwest First within 20 feet. Is that because this was just copied and pasted from the traffic engineers, where the traffic engineer was saying we should consider, or it kind of like back to the, I think the last meeting we had a conversation about using soft language Are we asking them to, or are we asking them not to?
He had worded this in a manner that he didn't want to make it a requirement that we eliminate on-street parking because that's so controversial. He says in an ideal traffic-considered manner, it would be best to have that conflict gone, and the sight distances would be much improved if you were to do that. But it's very common in downtown areas. You're going at such slow speeds. There's already buildings up to the property boundaries. You never have ideal sight visions, and so he was weighing that and decided that he did not think that it was important enough to make it an absolute requirement, so he's used the word consider, so that you know that in an ideal world, you'd eliminate those. And I believe that's referring to an exiting onto First from a parking lot that is no longer going to be built.
Right.
It's where the old police building is. And the last that I've heard is that parking lot isn't planned to be constructed. It's going to be a staging area for construction of the library.
So I get that, and I don't have any problems with them saying that, but I guess we have to decide whether or not we should prohibit that or not, as opposed to
Right.
we should ask the
And-
applicant.
And I
to
think that's
consider
why I
it.
was adding that, at least to maybe folks from FFA can verify, but I think he's referring to a driveway, a new driveway that would be constructed with a new parking lot, and we're not building that parking lot anymore, so it's irrelevant.
Gotcha.
Anyone else with questions for Brian or Angie as before we move to their experts? Because that's the next stage here.
I don't think we are.
Okay, let's go to the applicant's subject matter experts, in whatever order you guys want to do it.
Good evening, Chair Smith and Commissioners. My name is Carrie Richter. I'm an attorney at the law firm Garvey Schubert Bear. I'm here today as sort of special land use counsel for the city. I have served in this capacity as special counsel for the city for I think 10 years. But I've been on call, so I sometimes get calls from Brian, and then years go by and I don't get calls. And I got called from Brian right after you denied the previous decision, and I spoke with Brian and Greg a little bit about some of the issues that you all raised, and so I was asked to come back and talk about them. I have submitted a letter into the record. I hope you've had a chance to review it. I'm not going to restate everything that's in the letter, but I've been asked to deal with sort of two issues. One relates to building height and floor to area ratio issues, and the second is the owner consent. I'm going to take what I think is the easier one first, which I think is the building height and FAR issue.
Let me point to you on that. I don't think our first rejection had anything to do with the height or the FAR, period.
Okay,
I think it had to do with our interpretation that it was a two-story requirement.
okay,
So we can focus a little bit on that.
okay. The only place that I think the two-story requirement comes from is a purpose statement. Is that correct? 16.41.010 says floor to rear area ratios are intended to work with the building height and setbacks to control the overall bulk of the building. The proposed FAR in conjunction with the maximum lot coverage ensures that the development will be a minimum of 2 floors along the street in the C1 portion of the commercial core area. I think that's where
Got it.
that came from. I'd like to suggest to you kind of two things related to this. I read that sentence, that final sentence, to read, the proposed FAR in conjunction with maximum lot coverage ensures the development will be a minimum of 2 floors. That means that the development standards, the clear and objective development standards that deal with FAR will, more times than not, ensure that development is 2 stories. If the city intended the development standards to require a 2-story building, they would have said as much, and they don't. They require a building that is no taller than 60 feet high and a floor to area ratio of 80% for a single-story structure. So I think that you're kind of importing a requirement into the development standards that is not there other than in a purpose statement. Purpose statements are not approval criteria. They're purpose statements.
Let me ask you about that.
Okay.
You say that purpose statements are not approval criteria. How do you, we talked about this last time you weren't here, so maybe I would assume staff has probably mentioned this to you, that cases such as Donovan versus LeGrand, Jebusek is a famous land use case you're probably very aware of, that a city planning commission is great given deference on interpreting a comprehensive plan or a purpose statement as an approval criteria when the language, when there's express language or even unclear language as to whether it's an approval criteria. How do you, in your presentation, how do you distinguishing those cases from what we did, I guess?
Well, as I understand the case law, the Planning Commission is entitled to interpret the code. There's no question. And the Planning Commission can certainly interpret this purpose statement to be a criteria, even though the plain language doesn't require it.
Just that we shouldn't, is your argument.
My argument is that the more correct argument based on the express language that is here would be that one story is allowed, because the development standards allow one story. They don't prohibit one story. You have context descriptions about appropriate development in the CC zone to include 1 to 2 story buildings with commercial storefronts. That wouldn't be the appropriate context that you were designing against if only 2-story structures were allowed. You have pictures.
Is that context, let me ask you a question, is that context in the CC zone taking into account that not all of the CC zone is in the DCO overlay zone?
I believe that it does. It isn't the Canby Herald building within the CC zone in the DCO zone, which is described here in the photo. It shows a 1-story.
Where are you at on that?
I am on page 15, section 16.41.060, sub B talks about applicability, and then in sub 2 talks about sub areas. And it says this area is the heart, talking about the area along past Waite Park to 4th Avenue. This area is the heart of Canby. Here one will find city's most historic traditional commercial structures. The built environment is characterized by 1 to 2-story buildings with commercial storefronts,
Okay.
built up to the sidewalk and containing a more or less solid building wall. And if you look at figure 24, it's a picture of the Canby Herald building, and I believe that's a single story. The other thing that I would note about this is if you look at figure 21, which is on the left-hand side, page 14, you have largely 1-story buildings that look like 2-story buildings because they have high ceilings. And so I'm not, again, I think an interpretation of the purpose statement to require 2-story buildings would be inconsistent with this concept of having 1-story buildings with higher ceilings that give the appearance of 2-story, what would be 2 stories if you were talking about 10-foot stories. So with all due respect, I think an interpretation that requires 2-story buildings might get you in a bind later down the road with 1-story buildings that have taller ceilings. The other point I want to make quickly, and I know that the architects will talk about this further, I think that what is also key, a key purpose statement or component of the core commercial sub-area of the downtown is its historic buildings. And City Hall is a historic building, and it's 1-story. And compatibility, contextually, I think requires a 1-story building that gradually transitions to 2 stories. Because I think if it was an abrupt transition to 2 stories, you would lose some of the significance of City Hall as a historic building. And I think that's part maybe of the drafter's intent of allowing one-story buildings to deal with the historic compatibility issue. If it's okay with you, I'll move on to the owner issue. And I'm hoping I'm not speaking out of turn here. You asked Chair Smith about what will happen tomorrow night. And Mr. Michael is here, and he'll probably tell you in greater detail what will happen tomorrow night. But my understanding is that Canby Utility Board will consider the adoption of a draft purchase and sale agreement or lease back arrangement with the city. They will not execute that agreement tomorrow night. So we won't know much more tomorrow than we do today, other than Canby Utility Board's intent. As I understand the issue, the purchase and sale agreement and the lease back provide that the city does not have to buy the land if it can't get land use approval. And we can't get land use approval unless we own the land, under the Planning Commission's interpretation. So we're stuck. I appreciate the Commission's concern about treating applicants differently, and that we wouldn't want private developers coming in and saying, trust me, I have the underlying owner's approval, and let me go forward. I think this is a little bit different case for the reasons that Brian mentioned, that Canby Utility does know about this. They haven't opposed it. They've asked that this condition be imposed. And the other thing I might point out, and not to get overly legalistic, but the obligation to have the owner consent comes in as part of the completeness determination, not as an approval criteria. And the relevant standard says, when the application is received by the city, the planning director shall immediately determine whether the following essential items are present. If they are not, the planning director may choose not to accept the application, in which case the application shall be immediately returned to the applicant. And one of the items in the list is the signature of the applicant on the form, and the written authorization of property of record if the applicant is not the owner. I think what's important here is some language that says the planning director may choose. First, it's the planning director that makes this decision and not the planning commission. And second, it's a choice that the planning director makes. And there is some case law that says that once an application is deemed complete, you can't go back and pull the rug out from under the applicant and say, well, you didn't include this completeness requirement. I mean, this is a clear and objective standard. We either have it or we don't. And so ordinarily in these types of cases, you would adopt a condition of approval to make sure that this happens. And that's what we're proposing here. So I think that hopefully that helps explain why we're in a different situation now than we were when we were before you previously. When we were before you previously, there was no agreement in terms about the sale. And now there is agreement, at least in concept to terms. No purchase and sale agreement has yet been signed. I haven't seen the purchase and sale agreement. I don't know if Greg can comment about this, but my assumption is that the closing will happen sometime thereafter. So it would be, I don't know, 30 or 60 days, and certainly the land use approval, the purchase and sale agreement may provide that the land use approval has to be final. On all appeals have expired before the closing would occur. Any questions? I will be available.
I have one.
Sure.
And it goes back to the floors
Yeah.
portion of the buildings.
Yeah.
So you talked about the characterization and all that, so the purpose statement, and then you talk about it's characterized by. So how would those two, where it says these design criteria ensure that buildings will be 2 stories, compared to the characterization, which is basically just looking at it and saying, okay, it's 1 to 2, right? Currently, I walk out there right now and I'm characterizing it. I can see 1 and 2 story buildings. And some of them are legacy prior to this code being input in place, and some of them are not. I can't go out there and tell you which ones are which, and if there's 2 stories after that or not. So how does that differentiate then, in your opinion, with regards to the purpose statement, which is saying that this designed is the intent, we'll use the intent, is that everything should be 2 stories, and then we're just talking about versus historically and accurately and today and tomorrow with regards to characterizations.
Your question is, how does this purpose statement relate to these development standards then if there's all kinds of flexibility in the world between 1 and 2-story buildings?
Right.
I think that the answer to that is to encourage 2-story buildings unless it doesn't make sense to encourage 2-story buildings. And in this case, it doesn't make sense to encourage 2-story buildings because you have a context fabric of a historic building that's 1 story. And so you have a gradual transition to a 2-story building. And you get, with a 2-story building, with the 0.80 FAR, you wouldn't get necessarily a full block storefront coverage.
Right.
You would have a building that has half as much floor area piled on top of each other, so you'd have a parking lot, which wouldn't give you what the intent of the standard is, which is a complete pedestrian-friendly storefront wall. Thank you. Oh, sorry, sorry.
Don't get away here. So when you were speaking about the purchase of the piece of property by the city from Cub, you talked about clear and objective standards, correct?
Mm-hmm.
But in your statement on the second story issue, you also said that the I think it's this 41050 also has clear and objective requirements, and so you want us to accept clear and objective requirements for one, but a more flexible, and to quote you, more innovative approach to the second story issue, and ignore the clear and objective requirements. Again, I'm just a guy that owns a private business, and the plain language there where it says ensures that the development will be a minimum of 2 floors. I mean, there's no ambiguity there, as you said. It's a clear, concise, and it's rigid. And I'm having a very difficult time moving past that. I'm not sure that I can, but I'm willing to hear about it. But there's no ambiguity there, and I struggle with the idea that we can be innovative and flexible and subjective in allowing the city to skate on meeting these clear and objective requirements that you so clearly laid out. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, I understand.
We can't be clear and objective on one and ambiguous on the other.
Can I respond?
Oh, yeah. Hopefully.
I don't think that I am asking that, I'm not asking that standards not be complied with. I'm asking that you delay the timing under which you require that the standards are met for purposes of ownership in the event you determine that ownership consent is required. In other words, you still have to comply with the standard, you just don't have to comply with it today, you have to comply with it before you get building code. I look at that timing as different than the requirement to comply. But back to your more important point, I think the FAR provision that you are reading as clearly requiring a minimum of 2 floors. The sentence says, the proposed FAR in conjunction with the maximum lot coverage ensures that development will be a minimum of 2 floors. That says to me that it's the FAR along with lot coverage that ensures 2 floors. Doesn't say development shall be 2 floors. Right?
So it says it will be a minimum of 2 floors.
Okay, but how you get to a minimum of 2 floors is through the FAR in conjunction with lot coverage, right?
Let's give it the comment and not.
Okay, well, so,
Rhetorical questions.
sorry, well, so my point is there, if we agree that those two things lead to a minimum of 2 floors, then you go to the lot coverage. There is no maximum lot coverage, right? There is only FAR, and FAR in this area is 0.80. You can have a 1-story building at 80% lot coverage. And that, I think, is, I mean, that's the best I can do on the reading of the plain language.
Any other questions? Okay, let's move on to the next expert. If there's any more that want to. Don't spell it wrong this time, maybe locked out.
They make these passwords get longer and longer every
Patient
time.
because I've locked
Third
out
time's the
password.
charm.
Duck tearing.
I'll get going. Hi, I'm Carl Rafey, FFA Architecture and Interiors. And to get us into the design a little bit here, I want to get you oriented with our updated site and landscape plan. And at your prompting, last month, we went back and had further discussions with the fire department officials, got a better understanding of the requirements of this alley access that we were providing. And what we determined is that the entire width we were providing, as requested by the fire department, did not need, in fact, need to be paved with asphalt. We needed to have that width clear of building, but the actual paving driving aisle could be reduced from that. That enabled us to create approximately 6-foot wide planting strip along the majority of the southern elevation of our building. So that was key to getting us within the required amount of landscape for our building. At this one portion right here, we have the access for staff entry, and the book drop-off location. And that little area is treated with concrete pavers, which are permeable, and there is a certain percentage, not the entirety of it, but that is also allowed to contribute to our landscape requirement. Some other updates we made were over here on the western face of the existing City Hall. There is an existing concrete ramp, which is no longer going to be required for accessible exiting. We have other required accessible exits within the building. So we were able to reclaim that as landscaped area. Once that move was made, we were able to push our bike parking closer to the sidewalk and get additional landscaping next to the building there. And then the last thing was the way we're actually handling the paving surface for these bike parking locations is that we're going to use a grass pave, structural grass paving system that will support the bikes and the wear and tear while allow some grass to grow up and water to percolate down in those areas. So that combination of moves gets us up to an 8% landscaped area on site, which is just above the required area of 7.5%. I can give you a little look at what that looks like in the model. We were very pleased with the outcome, actually, of this. We think we have a better building for it. It really creates a nicer edge along this facade of the building, engaging the site, and overall will be a better project for it. So that was the big design move change coming in today, and I appreciate Commissioner Smith's comment that we did not need to rehash all the design from last time. But I did want to take a brief moment to touch on sort of the big design concepts here and sort of remind you all how we got where we are with this scheme. So these drawings will look familiar to you. The design really springs from this notion of working with and respecting the historic 1937 City Hall brick building at 2nd and Ivy, or Hawley. It's a one-story building. It's set back from the sidewalk. It's a simply detailed masonry mass, and it's of a really smallish residential scale even. So we've got a unique challenge, and we're building a 21st century library, and have the opportunity to recraft half a block of downtown Canby. So we really needed to think carefully about how we were going to have our building meet this historic building, how we were going to share a common entry, and how we were then going to further respond to the design guidelines and goals that are put forth today. So I can zoom in just a little bit closer scale and provide a little bit more information about how we're handling that. At our entry plaza, we're recessed we're pulled back from the face of the City Hall, and we're detailing those fascia and that entry as low as we can to just tuck in under that existing eave line of the City Hall. Additionally, we want the materiality of this entry piece to be as transparent and delicate as possible so that it really sets off the mass and the masonry of the historic City Hall piece. We're framing that entry with landscape planters. We have modulation of bays and the structure expressed. We have some signage that gives identity to the library side and the city council chambers side. We have, as discussed, the integration of bike parking and accessible ramps. Once we get a certain distance away from that City Hall, we're able to start stepping up the mass of the building to create a bit more of that urban presence that you're looking for. And so once we're about 38 feet away from the building, we bump up here to our first brick masonry piece of the building, which houses...
I don't want to completely cut you off, but let's expedite to...
There's only one more slide after this I have to get to.
Okay.
And that's about a 20-foot height purpose. We've got the concrete base and projecting sill. We've got the storefront glass and simply detailed masonry above it. Soldier course that heads the windows in a similar way the City Hall does, and a brick parapet articulated with some simple brick detailing. On the far other opposite end of the block, I have another enlarged elevation, just pulling out one of our typical bays from the largest mass of the library proper, which is the reading and stack spaces. I wanted to just zoom in on a little bit of detail on how we're handling that increased height. We have, again, that concrete bulkhead and windowsill, the more commercial feeling storefront, more open glass here. And as the facade moves vertically, it's broken down with a belt course and a canopy line here, and the windows above that become more finely detailed and articulate as we move up. And then the final piece over here on Ivy and 2nd, it steps back down again, and we get one more echo of that brick masonry City Hall vocabulary.
Two questions for you. First one, I personally like the taste of the brick and the glass together, but I read some commentary in the record, people commenting that the brick being sort of old-fashioned and the glass shiny windows being very modern clash with each other. Tell me, I'm not a design guy, so tell me why does that fit? And I can understand their point. There's obviously a modern element to an all-glass wall and a very historical aspect to a...
Well, we're building a bridge here, and we're really knitting together the whole facade as a whole. I think if I go back to this elevation, we really composed this entire elevation together, and the rhythm of the bays of this glassy piece is echoed and continues through the lower portion of these brick pieces, and you see the continuance of that rhythm in the window patterns there. So the varying layers are knitting together. Brick is a timeless material. I don't see it as old-fashioned anyway. We keep doing brick buildings, and glass and aluminum are almost as equally timeless. So
Okay. I hope that answered
don't-
their question.
yeah.
That's okay. I wanted to
Okay.
just get that. And my next question was for me. In the code, we've talked about the 2-floor requirement or that part of the code. It definitely does also in the part of the code that the attorney was just talking about. It talks about on the second floor of the wall, if you will, there's supposed to be a residential look to it. This doesn't appear to take into account any sort of residential look on the upper floor windows. Do you have any thoughts about that?
There are different ways that people live in residential worlds. I mean,